The idea that the afterlife is more rewarding than life on Earth has been present in many cultures. When such a belief is emphasized, especially in combination with honor, duty, or a divine mission, it can influence people's behavior in several ways. If death is seen as a transition to something better, risk-taking increases. Individuals may be more willing to participate in dangerous actions, such as war, especially if the action is perceived as meaningful or sacred. Promises of rewards, honor, eternal life, fellowship, beautiful women, etc., can act as psychological reinforcement. When such ideas are shared within a group, they are reinforced by social pressure, ideals, and stories of heroic deeds. The consequences can be great success for the group that has bought into the concept. They are prepared to make great sacrifices for the success of their group. For example, I can mention the fearlessness of the Vikings as a direct consequence of their religion because the goal of their life was to eat pork in Valhalla every night, and it was considered unworthy not to die in battle. The Nazis also had a tendency to accept heavy losses on the battlefield, especially the Hitler Jugend, which consisted of boys who were heavily indoctrinated in the morality of their time, which made them extra dangerous. This was due to, among other things, to the total media control from the leaders in Germany who had a vast influence over the upbringing of the youth, so that they became violent and at the same time accepted heavy losses in their own ranks. This is in stark contrast to the Russian forces that are currently wreaking havoc in Ukraine. They are at least aware of that their leadership does not care much about them because they call the front the meat grinder, which indicates that they have a correct perception of reality. The Vikings, on the other hand, could have called a battlefield Valkyria dating, although no one knows if there ever was a date. And speaking of which, both ISIS and Hamas also have a narrative that death through martyrdom will lead to access to beautiful women, which must be perceived as a very dangerous way to try to get a date. This probably works on really ugly men. It is strange that some men think that sudden death makes it easier to meet girls than to start talking to some of them. Is death cult dynamics a sort of Ponzi scheme? One operates in the realm of politics or belief, the other in economics. However, certain parallels emerge in how both systems sustain themselves and recruit followers. A Ponzi scheme is fundamentally dependent on continuous inflow. New participants are required to sustain the illusion of success and to pay off earlier participants. Similarly, destructive ideological systems, especially those described as death cults, often rely on constant recruitment and escalation. These systems promise participants a form of future reward, glory, salvation, national revival, or historical destiny. However, like the promised financial returns in a Ponzi scheme, these rewards are frequently unrealistic or indefinitely deferred. Another parallel lies in the manipulation of belief. Ponzi schemes depend on trust in the organizer and the narrative of success, even when evidence is thin or contradictory. Participants are often encouraged to ignore warning signs and to double down on commitment. In extremist ideological systems, this dynamic can manifest as propaganda, suppression of dissent, and reinforcement of a closed worldview. Followers may be urged to reject external information and rely solely on the internal logic of the movement, even when it leads to self-destructive outcomes. Escalation is another shared feature. In a Ponzi scheme, as obligations grow, the operator must take increasingly risky or deceptive steps to keep the system afloat. Similarly, destructive regimes or movements may escalate their actions, intensifying repression, conflict, or violence, to maintain control and sustain the narrative that justifies their existence. Each step deeper makes it harder for participants to disengage, both psychologically and materially. There is also the issue of sunk costs. In both systems, individuals who have invested heavily, whether financially, emotionally, or morally, may continue supporting the system long after its flaws become apparent. The fear of losing everything or admitting error can lock participants into a cycle of continued commitment, even as the system becomes more unstable. Finally, both structures tend to have catastrophic endpoints. Ponzi schemes collapse when new inflows cannot meet obligations. Likewise, systems built on unsustainable promises, coercion, or perpetual conflict often face crises when it becomes obvious that the reality is far from the narrative. The collapse can be sudden or gradual. Political systems and financial frauds differ in context, scale, and ethical dimensions. They do share patterns: dependency on recruitment, control of information, escalation, and unsustainability. And that is why they ultimately fail.